Good evening, everyone, and thank you for listening to the Futurati podcast, where we dive into how emerging technologies will impact the world and your bank account. I'm Trent Fowler, and today I am bringing you a rare solo episode. But my co-host, Thomas Fry, and I are futurists, keynote speakers, and consultants with decades of experience in analyzing trends and communicating new developments to audiences across the world. Reach out to us at futuratipodcast.com/contact-futurati if you'd like to hire us for consulting, to speak at your event, or to advertise on our podcast. So I just wrapped up an interview with Dr. Anton Howes. A while back, we interviewed Jason Crawford on The Roots of Progress. We've talked to Samuel Goria about how societies change and about how social revolutions occur, how social technology figures into that. And I have an as yet unpublished interview with Daniel Gollier of Maximum New York fame that covers some of the same ground. So this is a recurring theme for us. On the Futurati podcast, we think a lot about technologies. We think a lot about blockchain and quantum computing and artificial intelligence. But ultimately, those technologies, those ideas have antecedent roots, and those roots are worth studying to understand the long-term trajectory of how the technologies will play out in society, but also to understand how you can get more of them. How is it that you get more inventors? How is it that you get more people who are actively devoting their time to optimizing the world around them? And that was the subject of our interview with Dr. Howes. So he writes a Substack on the history of invention. He's a historian that focuses specifically on the Industrial Revolution and the history of invention. And we basically talked about that, talked about his research, talked about how it is that societies change, how it is that they grapple with new ideas, how those foment over time and eventually, burst onto the scene in a way that makes it feel as though they came out of nowhere, when in fact you can go back decades or centuries or millennia sometimes and find earlier iterations of that technology. So just understanding how it is that human beings grapple with the cutting edge, with their own frontiers of knowledge, and how it is that they push those frontiers back and mine those frontiers for new insights was what we covered. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. It's something I'd like to devote more time to in the future. So if you like this kind of thing, share the episode and, drop us a line and let us know so that I can prioritize it and get more people who talk about it. But it was a great interview. Dr. Howes is very warm and very knowledgeable about a subject matter. So I hope you find it as interesting as I did. And without further ado, this is our interview with Dr. Anton Howes. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Anton Howes. Dr. Howes is a historian of invention. He is currently writing a book on the causes of the British Industrial Revolution and is official historian for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce, as well as head of innovation research for the Entrepreneurs Network. He is a visiting fellow at King's College London, where he was previously lecturer in economic history. He regularly shares his research on the history of invention at his online newsletter, Age of Invention. If you enjoy this interview, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends. And don't forget to check out our website, futuratipodcast.com. Dr. Howes, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, your interests, and what brought you to working on the projects that you're working on today.
Sure. So I basically got involved with this kind of research because I was interested in economic growth during my PhD, which was a few years ago. And then I kind of increasingly started to look into the British Industrial Revolution, initially as a case study. Then it became the big thing that I started researching as a whole. And within that context, again, initially it was meant to just be a chapter of the PhD thesis, looking at inventors in particular. That has ended up being the past almost decade now of work that I've been doing. So it seems as though the more I do, the more I get into this. But basically, I'm a historian of invention. I study the cause of the Industrial Revolution, particularly why it is that you see this acceleration of innovation over the course of the 16th to the 19th centuries, the initial uptick that we're still kind of riding out.
Interesting. So what have you found about the causes of the Industrial Revolution that might surprise people? I mean, I think most of us learned the story that you had, the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, and we developed science. And then, of course, you built a bunch of stuff with it. What's there to explain? So what are some of the enduring mysteries or things that might surprise people or angles they may not have considered?
Sure. I think one angle that isn't often considered is just how early a lot of this stuff is taking place. You mentioned this kind of neat Renaissance to Enlightenment to scientific revolution to Industrial Revolution kind of categorization, this is not something that most historians even agree on at all. In fact, a lot of them, I find myself personally often skeptical of those kinds of labels. When I say the Industrial Revolution, and that's the thing that I study, I kind of use it as a shorthand because it means that people think, oh, okay, roughly 18th century, roughly inventions. Maybe it's kind of bookended by Dickens at the one end, and maybe Francis Bacon, or maybe a little bit later, the early steam engines, Thomas Newcomen and so on, at the earlier end. These are, I think, just kind of catchphrase words, but each of them is often kind of closely intertwined. And they're not necessarily phenomena on which there's a lot of agreement. So one thing that I think is a big, or maybe a big surprise to people who don't study this kind of thing in detail is, you actually have a lot of invention happening very, very early, much earlier than you'd expect. So we're talking Tudor times onwards in England. It's starting to already look quite economically unusual. You've got this dramatic growth of London in a way that I think is pretty much unprecedented in world history, in economic history, certainly. And then it's from that kind of uptick that you get a lot of the kind of the stuff that follows on when people talk of scientific revolution, enlightenment, and so on. I think a lot of these things are kind of pretty much the same thing, going into slightly different avenues of human activity.
That's interesting. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Which bit would you like to expand on? There's quite a lot there to get into.
Sure. Well, I'm curious. I've always just had kind of that linear model in my head, and if the Industrial Revolution goes back to Tudor times and arguably would have been parallel to the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or some of these other things, as opposed to just a straightforward outgrowth from it, then in what sense do they reflect on different parts of human endeavor, right? So is it just that the Enlightenment is the Industrial Revolution in politics and political philosophy, and then the Industrial Revolution is just that applied to commerce, or is there kind of more to it than that?
Sure. Okay. Well, let's unpack some of those terms. I mean, as I say, I really don't like using the terms, but it's worth kind of looking into what it is that people mean by them. When you say the Enlightenment, you might be saying, okay, sure, this is Montesquieu and Hume and the American Revolution and all these other kind of political ideas, and the French Revolution as a result of that too. And it's the kind of this idea of, the liberty, fraternity, equality, universalism that you start to see in a lot of political literature. But you might also say, okay, well, there's this other theory of industrial enlightenment that you see very similar ideas or very similar people being involved with industrial processes. So the potter Josiah Wedgwood, for example, keen abolitionist, but also an experimenter, one of the archetypical versions of the Industrial Enlightenment. People like James Watt, who are involved with a lot of the same kinds of groups of literati in Scotland in the mid-18th century, who's working on improving the steam engine. The various chemists, Lavoisier, the famous chemist, is executed during the French Revolution, arguably a kind of figure of this industrial or scientific enlightenment. Like, it's very difficult to actually kind of say, well, this is actually a particular strand that's very separate, or a particular kind of group or subculture. And it's not even necessarily clear that, it's not like people living through what we'd call the Enlightenment are necessarily cognizant of the fact that there is such a thing, right? The same way that, or even necessarily that it's a thing that's affecting all people at the same time all at once. Today, it's hard to think of, how would we periodize what's going on right now, or the previous 10 years or 20 years or 30 years? Like, are we part of some kind of other big, start it with a capital letter thing right now? A lot of us, I think, would look a bit askance, I suspect, at someone trying to use those sorts of labels. And also, a lot of airport books are kind of titled for those sorts of things for what we're currently going through or have been going through. I mean, the key thing that I think you see there is there's a great deal of disagreement over whether or not we actually are part of some big thing or movement. That's not to say there aren't big movements and there aren't kind of differences, but I think it's just a very, very complicated story to which we kind of have this thing sort of slapped on. There are some that are a bit easier to look at. So the Reformation, for example, is certainly something that we can talk about as a movement, even though it has lots of different elements to it, right? Because it's a reaction to the Catholic Church. But even there, you've got quite a lot of nuance going on. And it's not even clear exactly when it begins or where it ends, how much of it is just a kind of post-printing Reformation, or if there are earlier kind of elements of Reformation that There are earlier movements, pre-printing, that people are trying out similar things, but they're not quite kind of taking off in quite the same way. So there are big movements, but as to whether or not there is a phase in history that we can just say this is the Enlightenment or this is the Industrial Revolution, I think that's rather different. So I like to kind of disaggregate a lot of these things. So when you say scientific revolution, I think by that, maybe you're talking about Galileo, but then maybe even 100 and something years later, you're talking about Newton. Where does this thing begin? Where does this thing end? Some people say, oh, well, it's overturning the received knowledge of the scholastics or of the alchemists. But at the same time, if you look at alchemy or chemistry or whatever you want to call it, there's actually not that kind of clear a distinction between what these people are doing, often highly empirical, right? They are looking at testing factual knowledge. They're using experimentation and re-experimentation and going back over what the ancients had said and saying, actually, this isn't quite how it worked. But then a lot of people are kind of falling out of these categories or falling into them to the extent that I find they often kind of don't quite work. Now, that's not to say that there isn't, that's not to say that there isn't some kind of big shift or that there aren't big changes going on. Maybe it's just worth kind of enumerating what those changes are. Practically, economically speaking, in a kind of very direct way, if we look at the kind of economic change that's happening in Europe and then in particular in England at this period, you do have a kind of opening up of trade. England, in a kind of way that I think stands out compared to a lot of other places, sees this movement of the population, at least proportionally. So the population as a whole is growing, but proportionally what's happening is that a larger and larger number are living in cities. And actually not just cities, but in a particular city, London.
Right.
In a way that's kind of unique, that you don't really see elsewhere. You see similar rates of urbanization in other parts of the world, say in the Low Countries, what we call Belgium and the Netherlands today. But some of the reasons for that kind of urbanization are very, very different in the sense that, there you don't see this kind of agglomeration onto one particular megacity that you do with London. So you see that movement, and correspondingly, you see a movement, given people are leaving the countryside, or proportionally leaving the countryside and going to London, is you also see a movement out of agriculture into industry, right? So you're seeing what some historians will call, inverted commas, proto-industrialization. And again, it's unclear as to how that differs from industrialization, right? Is it, where is the dividing line? Or is this one of those kind of, I'll call it as I see it kind of things?
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time when people use those proto words, what they really mean is that they don't want to admit that this earlier thing is actually part of the same trend because they'd already defined a starting cutoff at one point in their history. And they're like, well, yeah, everything pre-1500, because that's where I've written my book, is going to be proto something. I think we can knock a lot of these things back. So you've got this movement out of countryside and also out of agriculture into industry, and also a growing variety of industry, and at the same time growing wealth. Very marked changes to material wealth, the kinds of goods that people have access to, the kinds of industries that are taking place, the variety of industries that are starting to pop up all over the place. We're talking paper making literally just before we started recording this, I was looking at what we nowadays call maiolica or delftware. So this is tin-glazed ceramics, various industries that we don't even necessarily think about as being part of the history of invention are starting to pop up or starting to develop in unexpected and exciting and creative ways, in a way that a lot of the time the kind of headline figures may be obscure when we start to look at these things in a kind of more zoomed out way.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
That's fascinating. So I'm sort of curious as to what your thoughts are on the ultimate causes that drive this sort of evolution in society. So one of my pet interests is just social change, right? So slavery was a part of, every major civilization since the dawn of civilizations. And then in the 19th century, we all said that that's enough of that, or the 20th century, and we outlawed it everywhere. And now it's basically gone, right? There's pockets of it, but we inverted it all together. And I'm fascinated by that phenomenon, by moral revolutions, or just revolutions, period, just like these large scale changes. And I'm just curious, as somebody who's done a really deep dive on this particular radically transformative period history, if you've given any thought to that, the etiology of these changes, and if there's comments you can make about the methodologies, like how would a historian suss this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually kind of key to why I call myself, rather than a historian of technology, which is an actual thing, I call myself a historian of invention, which no one else uses as a term, because I'm interested in the actual process of the change. Right, so not so much in the impacts of trade, although it's also interesting, and you do need to get to grips with all of that detail, but actually why people are doing the things that they're doing. So, I mean, slavery is actually a great one to look at as well, because you're right. I mean, there really isn't much, and this is something I've looked at a little bit into for some kind of separate work that I've also done. Not part of the kind of headline type stuff that I kind of put out and publish. But strikingly, that although if you kind of look it up on Wikipedia briefly, you'll say, there's kind of some kind of abolitionist movements in the ancient world and early Christian world, and other parts of, there's one in China, there's one in India. If you actually look into the detail of all those, they're not abolitionist in the way that we kind of think of late 18th century abolitionism. Right? They're not people going around saying we need to abolish the institution of slavery. Not even remotely like that. It's often kind of slight emancipations or one-off, like, this bunch of slaves will free them, rather than kind of getting rid of the institution in this kind of universalistic way. So this universalism, which we might call enlightenment, but universalism is kind of a really key and interesting thing here. If you look at and if you start to look at the people, I think the methodologically, the way to look at this is, I think, you need to look at the individuals involved, right? It's all very well to say, there's something in the air, or there's a culture of X, Y, Z. But ultimately, these sorts of actions come down to a very, very few people who, through whatever influence they have, or through persuasion, often by publication or interpersonal communication, sometimes face-to-face. If we're lucky, those things are written down and they survive, we can actually read them. But very, very few people changing the world around them and convincing others to act upon ideas, which is a kind of it's extraordinary thing, right? That something immaterial can make the material world so drastically change. That is, in a similar way, that's something that I think is so exciting about studying invention, is that ultimately invention is just reconfiguring matter that is all around us into a way that unlocks so many more possibilities than what we had currently been using. It's not like the world itself has changed drastically from ancient times. But what we can do with the world is, drastically different, right? We've unlocked that potential either through greater knowledge of how the world works, right? What we tend to call, in inverted commas, science, which literally just means knowledge, right? So greater knowledge of how the world works, but also through just applying our pre-existing knowledge that's out there amongst the people, it being known to someone somewhere, and finding ways institutionally, through the way that we organize ourselves and organize our knowledge, in order to get the most out of that for the most people. Right. And so, one of the big concerns early on, just to kind of give an illustration of that, is that there's loads of knowledge that's being produced since ancient times that's simply being lost, right? The inventor dies, they never pass it on to anyone else, and so there's this constant churn. This is why there's this obsession with the ancient world, or with the kind of antediluvian, the pre-flood, world. It's why Francis Bacon's New Atlantis talks about a pre-flood civilization, right? He's kind of harking back to, think about what if we just had continual development for this entire time without having these great cataclysms that are causing mass losses of knowledge. In the same way that we think it cataclysmic, just the other month there was a cyber attack on the British Library, which is one of the repositories of so much knowledge and archival material in the UK. They've been out for months and months and months because of a ransomware attack. It's a great extra example of the kinds of setbacks that you can have. These sort of, even that's not anywhere near as cataclysmic as, say, burning of some massive library, of which there are a few examples of that in world history. But it's kind of coming close where there needs to be, one of the key projects in this period is knowledge conservation, so that you can then build up that base of knowledge. And especially if it's useful knowledge, you can start to transform the world. So to answer that methodological point, I think you have to hear the individuals, and you have to look at what they actually say about their own motivations. Sometimes you have to infer that, but all the time they do actually write down what it is that they were thinking. And strikingly, a lot of historians or popular accounts, people using history, and this definitely goes beyond what we call professional historians, very often just ignore what it is that they actually say they were doing, or don't bother to look into it. A lot of that has to be pieced together and has to be inferred sometimes from a lot of kind of surrounding evidence, but ultimately it comes down to those individuals.
So it sounds like you subscribe to the great man theory of history, which I understand is somewhat controversial, but it reminds me of some of Samuel Breuer's work on institutional founders and how those ultimately change everything around them. To me, it seems sort of like an obvious read on history, but I do know that there are at least some professional historians who kind of push back on that. So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts on that methodological framing are.
Yeah, I think it's funny you could call me as obviously being part of the great man theory of history. Again, I might lose my his professional historian card if I subscribe to that for the reasons that you just mentioned. But I suppose the way I prefer to think of it is that, actually, I'll put it this way: great man theory. Let's call it great person theory, right? Great person theory, capital P. I think the bad rap that it got was that what happened was you got oversimplified, simplistic accounts of changes, which kind of ended up focusing on far too few people. Now, funnily enough, if you actually go and read some of the original works, and a great archetype here would be a book from the 1860s, called Self-Help by Samuel Smiles. This is one of the most important, it's just a huge book. Essentially, it's literally just a series of biographical vignettes of great men, right? It's one of the origins of great man theory, in which Samuel Smiles went and most of them inventors. He went and interviewed where he could relatives of the people who were often dead. I think all of them actually may have been quite posthumous things. Basically found whatever evidence he could and then wrote up these stories of here's how these people changed the world. And that's still kind of stuck to as a kind of narrative, and you still see loads of those sorts of stories, right? People have in their minds particular inventors that they liked, or scientists, or politicians, whatever, that they like to single out. But that's not to say, and I think this is where the criticism comes in, and I think it's a correct criticism. The correct criticism is that it's obviously not just about these people, right? It's about the other people around them and how they interact with all those other individuals. But I think the problem is that often the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, and that the pushback has gone so far the other way that it's almost as though nobody has any individual agency whatsoever, and it's all just a product of society. And that's so obviously rubbish, right? Like, we just know that that's not true.
Right.
It's not like absent Galileo, there's just going to be another Galileo who does exactly the same things or has exactly the same breakthroughs.
Or another Napoleon. Just somebody else would have picked the crown up out of the ditch and fought the Napoleonic Wars.
You're certainly going to have, but here's the thing, you're going to have other generals who are going to have other achievements, certainly, right? It's not like we're saying that, or possibly even extremely similar achievements, right? It's certainly a part of the history of invention that you get what are often thought of as being kind of cases of simultaneous invention.
Right.
But the reason for that, I think, is that if you have a certain group of people who are working in the same, what we might call a kind of idea space, right? A certain realm of possible combinations based on the current level of technology, so the current methods that we currently use, it's pretty inevitable that you're going to get a bunch of people coming up with similar ideas at similar times, but they're not going to be identical, right? They're just not. Like, there are basically no cases, I don't think, where you have the exactly identical improvements or the same level of improvement, right? So individual agency, I think, does matter. And this is not to say that, great person theory is true, but we do need to look at the individuals, and maybe we should call it great persons or just persons theory, right? It's like, it's not that there's a tiny little handful of people that I can count on that, with my digits, with my fingers and toes. But we're talking, a group in the thousands right, of people who are doing stuff. Because, like, let me put it this way: if there's perhaps a skeptical listener, kind of frowning deeply at what I'm saying right now,
as there surely will be,
and it's great that there are. But let me put it this way: in 1600, there really aren't that many people who are thinking deeply about, say, astronomy, right? And there aren't that many people who are systematically looking at the sky, kind of counting the number of stars, right? The number of that people is probably going to number in the hundreds, or maybe at a push the thousands. And frankly, those are the people who matter for whatever developments there are going to be in astronomy in that period, right? So, and yes, that's a collective endeavor, right? Like, so that is a small group of people who, some of them will be more diligent than others. Some of them, when they make discoveries, will be more persuasive than others. Some of them will maybe not bother to actually tell anybody what they've seen. Some of them will. I mean, there's going to be a great variety of things happening there. And the ones that will end up eventually calling great, inverted commas, are going to be the ones who, were the most charismatic, or the most diligent, or made the most discoveries, or the best self-publicizers, or whatever. Fine. But ultimately, it's still that collective endeavor of a very small group of people who are doing those things, right? And to say otherwise, I think it's taking it too far.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati Podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
It's interesting. It's almost like it would be better called vanguard theory. It's like there's a relatively small number of people who operate in a context that's established by a much larger number of people, but they're ultimately the motive power of the changes.
That phrase. You know what? I'm going to steal that. I'm going to use that phrase. That hasn't been used elsewhere, has it? That's great. That's
not that I know of. Really well. Not that I know of. Well, so
it's upper tail human capital, which is, I believe, John McKean's phrase for it.
Very interesting. So you cast a pretty wide net, and one person we've spoken to about where innovations come from is Jason Crawford, who does all this work on progress, and that's a lot of fun too. I was wondering if you've gone deeply into any particular case studies of invention. I find those very fascinating, like people who do deep dives and read everything Darwin wrote and then try to back a theory out of that, of how it was that he came up with this idea, and even get into his head a little bit and note the kinds of evidence he was looking at and what he was discarding and how all that came about, because I think that's very worthwhile. Stephen Johnson did something similar with his book, Where Great Ideas Come From. So I was just wondering if you've drilled down into any of those, and if you had anything interesting to say about particular episodes of invention that we might mine for insights today.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's pretty much all I do all the time.
Okay.
Is come up with, well, basically a lot of this stems from a kind of fear that I have that I've either got something wrong or I have myself oversimplified something, given I often criticize the kind of, not others particularly, but others in a general sense of not doing this kind of work. So I tend to go, above and beyond all the time myself to try and really get to grips with developments of particular industries and looking at where certain ideas are really coming from. Partly also, though, because there's just so much rubbish out there. I think the moment you hear a just so story, right, the kind of Rudyard Kipling style, and then they invented this because there was this very simple set of factors, or I don't know. Here's an example I haven't looked into, but I'm immediately skeptical of, right? Just as an example of the sort of story to be immediately skeptical of. This idea that Johannes Gutenberg combines the wine press with, the need to print a lot of things, and that he's sort of inspired in some way by wine presses. This doesn't ring true to me in any way, right? This is not like something. I don't think that's how invention works, that people are just looking around and they're like, well, I'll just mush together this industry with this industry and we'll get something new. I suspect it's a lot more complicated than that. And what often happens, and again, I haven't looked into this one, but it's just an example of the way the story is framed that often gets changed, is I bet you, well, I shouldn't bet, but often when you see those sorts of stories, when you actually trace them back, it'll be that there was a historian who speculatively said, well, maybe it was like this because there happened to be a vineyard nearby or a winemakers nearby. And somehow through the citation chain, as one person cites another and another and another, that becomes, this is definitely how it happened.
Yeah.
Like you get those things all the time in history. But to give you examples of ones I've looked into in great detail, and often with surprising discoveries, one I spent a lot of time last year looking at was the steam engine. And the
popular one.
Steam engine. Yeah. I mean, this is like one of the best ones to start with because everyone's heard of the steam engine. Everyone thinks it's incredibly important. But it's what's amazing is how many things you can discover that people haven't really bothered to look into. I think partly because a lot of the attention, and there are a lot of people who do a lot of great work on this stuff, but nearly all the attention is post 1712. It's on the Newcomen engine used for pumping out mines. Which is the one that you can go and find 1,001, animations, illustrations of it out there. That's the one that everyone focuses on. And for some reason, the Savory engine, which precedes it just by a few years, so patented in the 1690s, presented before the Royal Society in the 1690s by Thomas Savory, and actually continually used throughout the 18th century as well, even though it's not quite as effective in the same ways. Because it has, there are slight physical differences between the two engines, different things that they can do. This is actually kind of the early kind of actually popularly widespread used one. The big discovery I made was that actually a lot of the kinds of things that you see in the Savory engine are a lot more ancient, and you can pretty much trace them back to ancient times. Well before, and this is what the common narrative has. The common narrative has it that effectively you have vacuum science, the discovery that the atmosphere has a weight, and then the exploitation of that weight by creating vacuums artificially. That's the science in the mid-17th century that then gets exploited and results in the steam engine. And I myself have published, you can go back and find a Substack where I myself have told that story as though it's fact. And then I've had to kind of about a year and a half later, go back over it and say, yeah, it turns out this is not true at all, because people are exploiting vacuums without calling them vacuums. So there's actually a lot of mechanical exploitation of it. You see it in the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. You see it in various manuscripts that go back to the Middle Ages, which are themselves derived from, we think derived from ancient sources. So experiments by Philo of Byzantium and Hero of Alexandria, all exploiting this particular effect, which is essentially that if you heat up a bunch of air or steam and then you cool it down within a vessel, you can basically create a sort of suction effect. What is actually the atmosphere outside of it pushing back into the kind of partial vacuum that you've created. That's how we think of it today. But back then it's like, it's just a suction effect. And that's all you need for a steam engine, right? As long as you can exploit that suction effect and use it to great in the particular industrial processes, you don't need to necessarily to have the science underlying it. And so, I've become really fascinated by this, partly because it really stands out to people, but also because it's amazing just how much you can overturn the kind of common narrative of these things with quite a bit more detailed digging. And this, I don't even kind of claim any particular special insight here, other than I kind of came across a thing by accident. I was looking for something completely different and saw what was essentially a 1615 solar-activated fountain, which exploited atmospheric pressure without calling it that. And I was like, that right there is a Savory engine, right? In a kind of very rudimentary form. It can't do a huge amount of work, but ultimately it's still a Savory engine. So this is actually work I've done with Jason Crawford, who you mentioned, where we put together on his Roots of Progress website a kind of animated series of animations where you can chart it, because I think it kind of needs to be out there that there's this, not only is there an alternative history here, which I think is more accurate, but it also tells us quite a lot more about where these ideas come from and also just how slow it can be. When you don't have that many people working on a particular idea over the course of human history, you can have the basic principles in people's minds, or at least in a select few people's minds, but for them to actually go to all the extra trouble and experimentation of actually applying it in a way that's going to, yield massive results. That takes a lot of waiting, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it requires the development of much sharper epistemological tools as well. Like the rise of science strikes me as one of those revolutions, epistemological revolutions, because you're right. It's maybe not well known, but it's become much more common knowledge that, long ago, ancient peoples had engineering technologies that were really remarkable. Like the Antikythera mechanism is probably the canonical example, but we're forever digging new things up, and it turns out that they had rudimentary calculus, or they had rudimentary this, or they had rudimentary that, thousands of years before we thought they did. But what they lacked was a way of pinning it down really systematically and like clearly understanding the context in which this operates and like sharpening that vision of it, because that's what you need to make, a real artificial vacuum, the kind of thing you would need to test particle physics theories or to even have particle physics theories, that sort of thing. So I find that whole story very fascinating, is like how we're tripping over these things, then we come back to them, and then we sharpen it, and it just rolls around for a long time and then sort of explodes on the scene. Maybe that's part of the genesis of these moral revolutions, is that, or technological revolutions, they just ferment for a long time. And then there's a new piece that comes into view, and that is what unlocks the next level of understanding reality.
Yeah, and actually another example that kind of springs to mind when you mention it, again, one that I've done a bit of research on, was, again, I was looking at something completely different, and I kept noticing from the late 16th century, early 17th century, lots of mentions of oranges and lemons for the long ship voyages to stave off scurvy. I was like, that's pretty early, considering the famous experiments meant to be in the 1770s. And then there is also this story, I forget the blogger's name, but kind of did a really interesting write-up about how the knowledge of using citrus was sort of lost in the late 19th century, early 20th century by a lot of the polar explorers. So they had been looking into, they for some reason thought that it was more to do with meat and kind of rancid meat rather than looking at citrus. But they were using, it was actually, if you go back and you look at the studies of scurvy, turns out they very early on realized that oranges and lemons were a cure for scurvy. The problem was they didn't realize that they could use basically any vegetable matter that contained what we call vitamin C in order to cure scurvy. And so there's these absolutely appalling journals of voyages where they're literally, they've arrived on an island and they're dying of scurvy. We're kind of like, but there's no oranges and lemons around. You're like, there's literally all this other vegetation around you that you could be eating. Yeah. Or you see them mention that they do collect various vegetation, but then they boil it, which means that all of the vitamin C is like instantly destroyed. And so the cure was all around them at that time. But they, instead of having this kind of general theory about what it is that they need, or even just, thinking of it as a disease to which there is a cure, a specific cure, rather than it being a deficiency, is kind of the interesting thing. And that's, even the name for vitamin C as ascorbutic acid, right, literally means, scorbutus is scurvy. So it's the unscurvy acid, right? It's the one that, like, it is itself named after the lack of the disease. Which is kind of a neat parallel there to how the actual idea of scurvy even develops, right, from disease to deficit.
I do know I do know who you're talking about. I can't remember their name either, but I know the blog you're talking about, where it was. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's one of these situations. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's one of these situations where it's like, does violence to the standard idea of Occam's razor, because like as they're exploring the possibility space for this theory, it's like all these if-else conditionals going all the way down, and it turns out that no, it really is just this weird phenomenon, and like some kinds of meat work and some don't, and like it doesn't work if you put it in copper because for some reason it leaches the relevant nutrients out. It just ends up being this like, yeah, big weird picture, and sometimes that's just how it is.
Yeah, knowledge is a weird thing, and as you say, specific things can have a big impact. I mean, actually, the copper thing you mentioned is curious as well, because there's been quite a lot of work recently to test alchemical recipes and medieval recipes and medicines, and there was some work done on, I think, an Anglo-Saxon maybe an Anglo-Saxon cure for various, I think for a kind of, it was either a particular, I can't remember exactly, it was either a particular worm infestation in the eyes or something, or maybe it was kind of bacterial. And they did the test more recently using modern methods, and discovered that if they used the copper pot exactly as prescribed versus the glass flask that they just had lying around, that it actually had the desired effect and created a medicine that actually worked versus, just trying to test it another way. I mean, another great example is terra sigillata, which were essentially earths. So sigilled earths, so marked earths. You get these kind of balls of, to all intents and purposes, look like clay, and stamp them. And these were exported all over Europe. And it increasingly discovered kind of new terra sigillata, or boluses as they called them, different parts of Europe as medicines. And they completely fell out of fashion in the 19th century thanks to modern chemical analysis, because the chemists, many of them, especially in Germany at the forefront of chemical analysis, they basically looked at the stuff and they're like, it's just clay. People are just imbibing this clay, and it's just, nonsense, superstition, witchcrafty nonsense. Turns out, thanks to more recent scientific investigations and a lot of the advances that we've had in biology, that a lot of the museum samples of these terra sigillata actually contain, because of the way the clay was treated, so not the clay itself and its chemical constituents, but the kind of, I guess the essentially, because of the way they were treated, they were often imbibed with stuff very similar to penicillin, or in the same family as penicillin. So they probably did have some antibacterial properties and probably did work for certain different diseases. Now, obviously, they wouldn't have known what's bacterial, what's viral. Even in the same way today, a lot of doctors, you go in, they don't know whether or not the disease that you've got is from this or that different source. But they might prescribe this thing, I think, in the early modern world, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries when these things were in use. And very often they probably would have had some effect. So, I mean, I love kind of these rediscoveries of knowledge, because so much of this stuff is empirical, right? Like, presumably people did tests and these things seem to work. And yet this knowledge is either lost or kind of almost obliterated by other forms of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder if maybe that's what drove some of the ossification around the traditions for this medicine. It's like you always do it exactly the same way every time, because they didn't have a deep causal understanding of the mechanisms. They just do, if you were very careful and you followed the exact steps, it seemed to work. And if you deviated on any of them, it seemed not to. And they didn't know why, but, they still preserve that knowledge and that tradition. So I don't know, that's another sort of interesting epistemological question there. I wanted to get your thoughts here in the last 10 minutes about prescriptive approaches to invention or innovation. Given that you spent so much time studying where these ideas come from and what sorts of conditions are required to foster them, if you had any advice on how to structure a civilization or make grants work in order to get more science or more technology or faster solutions to problems today. So I know that's something that's on a lot of people's minds, and I thought you might have some wisdom to share.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the basic mental model I have for this sort of thing is that given, and I might use your term, vanguard theory, given you have very few people who work on these problems, one of the main ways in which you can speed these sorts of things up, if you're interested in invention, is to grow the size of the vanguard, right? Is to have more people working on these sorts of problems and thinking deeply about them. More people who are doing invention, more people who are doing science. Now, in a way, it's very easy, I think, given the way the modern world is, to kind of become a bit blasé about this and say, well, look, actually, there's more inventors and scientists alive today than any other period in human history. And I think that's absolutely true, right? Just not only is the population absolutely gigantic compared to how it was historically, but the number of people who can essentially devote themselves full time to looking at these sorts of questions is astronomical. It's absolutely gigantic. It's huge. And the proportionality of it doesn't even matter in a sense, right? You don't need to have 10 inventors of the toilet to get the toilet. You just need one inventor to have this effect potentially on the whole of humanity. So because invention proceeds for the most part in a kind of aggregate way rather than a kind of absolute way rather than in a proportional way, The absolute number of inventors and scientists is the most important thing, not how many they are as a proportion of the population. And that's the number of those people is big enough. But as I say, it's very easy to get kind of complacent there and say, well, that's great then. That means science and technology just to proceed apace and we don't really need to worry about it. But then ultimately, again, it comes back to human agency. We do need people to be motivated to do those things and to solve those problems and to think, actually, if I don't do this now, it'll be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50, 100 years from now, rather than now. And there are real costs to that, right? Like there are real costs in the same way that people have looked at, when they look at, regulatory reforms and whether or not the FDA is doing a good enough job. People calculate what is the cost in human lives of the vaccine being delayed by so and so months, right? That is the case for all invention, not just in cost in human lives, but cost in, our welfare, our living standards, our ability to enjoy our lives, our experience of our lives, right? Those delays, I think, are significant, and so the more, the better. But that, I think, is the key way to look at it is that there's a very small subset of the population who have what I call an improving mentality, who look at the world around them and they say, that could be better. And then not only do they say that could be better, but they actually start thinking deeply about the ways in which they can actually be the agent of that change and say, I'm going to be the person who's going to make it better. In the same way that, those people are all around us, but very few people, I think, act upon that urge. And very few people even not only act upon that urge, but even have that urge at all, right? A lot of people, a great majority of people kind of are just trying to get by. They're just kind of going about life normal way. They're not trying to optimize, right, all the time, the things that they currently already do, or even find it kind of searching for new areas in which they can optimize things. In the same way that, not everyone is optimizing, I'll put it this way. There's a certain kind of person, right, who has a spreadsheet for everything in Excel that they're like trying to constantly work out what's the best way to do a particular thing that they do and be not just the best at it, but the kind of best version of themselves at this thing.
The non-satisficers, the optimizers.
Yeah, I like to call them optimizers, I guess, because they often choose one avenue and they become utterly obsessed with it. And if you look at the way that inventors historically have talked about themselves or talk about one another, they're often optimizers in that exact same way. They're keeping these meticulous notebooks and working out all of the different experiments, and they're trying to solve maybe some particular problem that they've just become somewhat obsessed by. Or even in many ways, taking the status quo and just thinking and kind of reframing elements of it as being problems that are in need of solving in order to kind of obtain some kind of betterment. And I like to use improvement as a word there, because so much of invention appears like it's this kind of out of the blue thing. The steam engine or the hot air balloon or these kind of big landmarks, if you like. When actually, if you, again, drill down into the detail, they're just collections of improvements. In the same way that if you zoom out, you start to see with the work I've been doing with Jason on the steam engine, it's actually kind of this series of incremental steps. Some of them done by different people, sometimes done by the same person because they spend 10 years, but rather than just 1 year looking at this problem. Sometimes done in isolation because they haven't heard of what the improvements the other guy had done, in another country or 100 years earlier. And then kind of having to reinvent those steps. But ultimately, it all comes down to that kind of incrementalism. But because it's so incremental, I think the number of people doing it matter the most. And so when we think about encouraging invention, encouraging progress, I think the main thing we need to think of is how can we just increase the size of the pool of people who are kind of working, who have that optimizing, that improving mentality. And that, I think, is probably the sorts of interventions that will have by far the highest rewards, but I think have by far the least attention because it feels so mushy, right? It's like, how do you get people to adopt a culture or be part of a subculture, right? These are the least precise, they're the least kind of, the most difficult things to measure and have a randomized controlled trial on it, whereas all these things that you can do with people who already have that mentality, how to get them the most resources through grants, whatever, those get by far the most attention because they're quite easy to study.
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuraudiopodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
Yeah, it's increasing the pool. It's increasing the pool versus funding the pool. Yeah, we actually just wrapped up an interview which has not gone live yet with Daniel Gollier, the Maximum New York guy. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's done a lot of this. The interview wasn't about that in particular, but I did ask about institutions and how a person might go about building a movement, and he had some interesting thoughts about it. So you might check that out when it comes out. But I think we've for today taken enough of your time. So are there any last minute nuggets you want to leave the Future Audio Podcast audience with?
No, I think I've left you with a lot of very maybe some counterintuitive and idiosyncratic beliefs of mine already. There's loads more that we can go into, but maybe for another time.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And there's plenty to chew on here. And I really appreciate your time. Thanks for doing this so much. And we all wish you the best of luck in future endeavors.
Thanks very much, Trey.